In Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, Jesus teaches about lust and adultery. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, lust and adultery are things that are actually very much against God's will, or they go against God's design for relationships. Adultery obviously distorts God's view and design for marriage, that, sex is something that can only be accessed through a man and a woman in a loving relationship, a lifetime commitment, which we call marriage. So in that way, adultery distorts that design of God. But in the same way, lust also distorts God's design. Because if you look at Genesis chapter 1 and verses 26 and 27, it tells us that all of us are made in the image of God. But when people lust after someone else, or they look at them with lustful eyes, what they actually do is to reduce the image of God in that person, reducing the value of that person from, being in the image of God to actually saying your value is almost now reduced to some form of a commodity. And you'll see that our culture is a culture that wants to promote this. Even if it's in advertising, we see that lust is something now that is made quite normal, where people are actually dehumanized and turned into commodities that you can use to promote some kind of a product. So this is why God is very much opposed to this. But another reason why God opposes this thing, Saint Augustine tells us that when lust is indulged, it becomes a habit. And when a habit is unrestricted or unresisted, it actually becomes a necessity. This means that there are a number of people who are actually trapped in this sort of thing, where they are trapped in their minds, internally sort of dying, struggling with this sort of thing, this form of a lustful addiction. And sometimes we always view adultery as, something that just happens maybe accidentally, or, some form of a thing that happens maybe as a mistake. But it's important that we understand, in the same way that, before a tree rots on the outside and the leaves begin to fall down, it's the roots that begin to be corrupted. And so when our hearts are corrupted, they begin to corrupt our whole body and our whole behavior. So before the tree actually falls, what actually happens is that it rots in the inside. And when it's rotten in the inside, it doesn't matter how green the branches look, but eventually that tree will fall. So the only way that we can help that tree not to fall is to deal with the problem at its root. And so this is Jesus actually saying that we need to deal with the heart of the problem. Now, we've emphasized that the heart is the issue, but it's actually not just the heart. In Job chapter 31, verse 1, Job says, "I've made a covenant with my eyes that I will not look at a young woman lustfully." What Job is beginning to recognize is that before I lust after someone, I need to first look at that person. And so really the eye is what protects my heart. And Jesus picks up on this idea in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says the eye is the lamp of the body, or it's the window to the soul. If the eye is unhealthy, the whole body will be unhealthy. This means that we need to be careful what we actually look at, because what we look at will influence our hearts. It will influence our attitudes, our desires. And that's what Jesus is actually trying to deal with, to say there is a behavior, but there's also a principle or a value. And so what the person values internally will begin to affect the behavior that they have. But if your values are actually not right, your behavior will not be right. And so this means then when we are managing or controlling our bodies, we need to actually control what we allow access to our eyes, the things that we allow to have influence on our eyes, the things that we watch, right? I think as Christians, we need to actually begin to actually stand up against the world, the way that the world has now normalized this sort of thing, where even if you're watching a movie that dehumanizes someone else and reduces the image of God inside of them, we need to be able to actually get up and leave that movie, because we're not just speaking against this dehumanizing of people, but we're actually saying, I'm protecting my own heart from this corruption. Because I think if we allow this to become something normal, it then begins to affect us internally, and then our desires are changed. Then we begin to desire the things that God does not desire for our lives, that we go against God's design. And so it's important that we understand that we need to hate the things that God hates, and we need to love the things that God loves. The things that God is opposed to, the dehumanizing of people, the distortion of God's design for marriage and love, those things we actually need to hate with a passion. But equally so, the things that God loves, man, God's design for the family, the purity and the sacredness of marriage, we need to actually embrace those things and actually live them out, so that people will begin to see the truthfulness of the gospel in our lives.